The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Unit 2, which is about the 4 stages of team development, and looking forward to working with you over the next hour. And as usual, I'll be sending you a copy of these slides at the end of the presentation, perhaps not this afternoon, but certainly over the weekend. And you'll also get a copy of the recording as well. So we had a few sound issues, I think, last time as I checked. So I'm hoping this is coming across loud and clear. In fact, I'd like to just check that. Could I ask you just to type in the word clear in the question box, just to let me know that it's coming across loud and clear? And if it's not, good. Thanks, Maxine. Thanks, Julene. Thanks, Elsie. Thanks, Gavin. Okay, sounds like it's coming across loud and clear. So, really, what I'm going to do is move on to the program so that we can just see where we're up to and what we've been looking at and what we will look at in the future. And of course, this whole unit's about producing high-performing teams. So, you'll recall a couple of weeks ago we looked at the characteristics of high-performing teams, and there were 8 characteristics, and I'll just review those shortly. And your homework there was very much around looking at one of those characteristics and thinking about what you might do to improve that characteristic. And the good news, of course, is that once you improve one characteristic, it actually has a positive impact on other characteristics. So they're all interrelated, of course. So today, of course, I won't elaborate on what we're doing today because I'll do that shortly. Then we'll look at some tools for leading teams. So, for example, when should you be collaborative? When should you be fairly directive? And what's in between those two extremes? And so you should be varying your leadership style, in other words. In Unit 4, we'll look at the roles that people play in teams, and that's based on some reputable research that demonstrates that people do consciously or subconsciously play roles in teams. So we'll look at that. In Unit 5, I'm going to give you a diagnostic to complete. It'll be a paper and pencil diagnostic. And the idea of that is that when you come along to Unit 5, you'll have an opportunity to determine what your preferred conflict resolution style is. And it's likely that you're probably using your preferred style too often. And what I'm going to be suggesting in Unit 5 is that you attempt to use a variety of negotiation and conflict resolution styles depending on the circumstances you're in and, of course, the people that you're negotiating with. And then finally, how do you produce a team culture that's productive? So what are some very practical tips and hints on how you might do that? So we'll look at a few of those that I know are tried and proven. So that's pretty much where we're going with the program. So let's get stuck into Unit 2 today. Now, before I do that, I just want to, and this will come up on your screen now, which is the characteristics of high-performing teams, which we covered last time, a fortnight ago. And the argument is, of course, as I said, if you try to work on one of these, it's likely that it will impact positively on another. Of course, the flip side's true. For example, if you don't have open communication in your team, it's likely to impact on trust and mutual respect, and vice versa. If you don't have trust and mutual respect in your team, it's likely to impact on open communication. In other words, people may not be quite so comfortable expressing their point of view in team meetings and so forth. So those are the characteristics. I hope you've had an opportunity to reflect on those, and more importantly, that you've tried to implement something that would assist in those areas. So I don't doubt for a minute that there are other characteristics of high-performing teams, but I know in my experience these are the 8 that are critically important. And I wrote an article probably a couple of months ago now, and which was exactly entitled Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And it got about 40,000 hits. It's still going strong on LinkedIn. And it really resonated with people to a point where I'm now writing my 9th book on this and wanting to, because I realise it's quite popular and user friendly. So those are the characteristics, and I think, as I said before, there are probably many, and of course they're open to interpretation. But I think I've tried to make them as clear as I probably possibly can. And one of the things that I think, if I could just touch on this, is if you look at the top where it says sense of purpose, a very good exercise would be for you to ask in a team meeting, each go around the table, each team member, you just simply ask them and you say, what do you think our number one purpose is as a team? Now, you'll find that's a very interesting question to ask, and probably more interesting would be some of the responses. What I'm hoping, of course, and what I'm sure you're hoping for, is that everyone's got a similar kind of perspective on what the purpose of the team is. So what's the higher purpose of the team? Why is it a team, and who does the team serve? Is it an internal stakeholder, or is it an external stakeholder? And, could you define in one sentence what the purpose of a team is? And you just go round the group and just hear what people have got to say. Now, you don't have to evaluate them. I think that puts people on the spot, but it's a really good opportunity for you to get a handle on whether people are really aware of what the purpose of the team is. And I did this with a group of managers not too long ago, and what happened was that each of them told me what they thought the purpose was. This was a management team, and none of them in the whole team had mentioned anything about people, which I found really interesting. So it was all about getting the product out the door, or servicing the customer, or whatever, those sorts of things, which is obviously important. No one disputes that. But I thought being a team of leaders and not mentioning anything about human beings was quite interesting, because obviously leaders are about getting the best out of people and so forth. So I just gently mentioned that at the end when we did the round table, just to point out that perhaps we need to refocus on the fact that we have people in our team, and it's not just all about products and services. As important as they are, we've also got to acknowledge that a leader is about getting the best out of people. Anyway, it's an exercise you might like to try, and you'll be pleasantly surprised at how effective that is, just in terms of something a bit interesting and new for your team to do. All right, now, so what are we covering today? Now, I want to just point out, we'll talk about the 4 stages of team development, and this is based on Bruce Tuckman's model, and it's been around for quite a while. I think it was 1969 he put this together, but it's still very important. And if you've got a team that you've been leading for a period of time, they will still be in one of these 4 stages. And your job, of course, is to move them through these 4 stages of maturity to get them to the point where they're high performing. And equally, if you've got a new team, it might be important for you to kind of think about how you might mature that team, thinking about these 4 stages. So I'll give you the second thing I'll talk about is the characteristics of each stage, and how do you know what stage your team's in? So what are the characteristics that demonstrate that? And the third one is to look at some of the things that you can do as a team leader with each characteristic. In other words, how can you lead at each stage which is effective? What do people need, and so forth and so on. So that's what we're covering. No problem, Lisa. Thank you for letting me know. Not that I'd know anyway, but thank you and welcome to the presentation. And you've probably just come in time anyway, so don't be too worried about that. Now, what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about high-performing teams. Of course, we can't really break up into small groups, but if you think about high-performing teams, we did talk a little bit about this before. It is really a small group of people with complementary skills who are committed to the purpose, organisational goals and common approach for which they're accountable. This is a very complex topic because it's hard enough managing one person, isn't it? But to manage several people in a team context is quite complex because you've got relationship issues, you've got different priorities, and so forth and so on. So it's not that easy, and I'm sure you're aware of that from a very practical point of view, and I guess that's why you're involved in this approach. Okay, so let's have a look at how we might deal with that. So how do we get people to a high-performing teams? Hi, Chelsea. Welcome. So let's have a look. And these are the 4 stages. And I just wanted to sort of unpack. We'll look at the big picture, and then I'll obviously talk about each. And as the session goes on, we'll get more and more practical in terms of what you need to do at each step. So if you look over on the left-hand side, you'll notice it's the effectiveness of the team. So up the top of the page, high effectiveness, bottom of the page, low effectiveness. So that's the team's capacity to achieve its objectives. And then across the bottom, you've got the performance of the team. And really what that means is the maturity of the team, or how far along the path they've travelled. So the 4 stages of team development are, and it's nice the way this is Tuckman, has thought this through. We've got forming, storming, norming, and performing, which is a nice little neat model. And I'm going to obviously talk about each of these characteristics as we go through, but at each stage of this team, or each stage of this team development, I should say, you'll find that the team is exhibiting certain characteristics. Where the team is at a low ebb is, of course, as you can see on the model, in the storming stage, and you could probably work out what storming is. It's where people are, pretty much there's sort of little cliques developed in the team, and the team aren't clear about what the objective is and so forth. I suspect that a lot of your teams are probably in the norming stage. In other words, they're getting on with the job, but they're probably not high performing. So obviously what you're aiming to do is to get them to the right-hand side in the performing. And my objective is to give you some tips on how you might get your team through this cycle to get them to be performing. Now, if you've got a high-performing team, congratulations, but you might also want to reflect on how you got there. And so this model will help you kind of understand the journey that you've taken to get people to that stage of performing. So it's kind of an interesting approach. It's certainly been well researched, and it's certainly got a lot of validity. A lot of people are aware of this model. Some of you, of course, would have seen it before, but it's worth reminding ourselves that teams do predictably go through 4 stages of development, and you as the leader have to actually do something different at each stage in order to get the team to the next stage. Because if you don't, what happens is the team gets stuck in that stage. And if they're stuck in that stage, you're in a situation, obviously, where they're not high performing. So let's have a look at each of those in a little bit more detail and understand the characteristics of each of those particular stages. So if you look at the forming stage, this is where the team, this is usually happens where you've got a new team. Maybe there's been a bit of restructuring in the business or the organisation. And so what's happened is you've got a group of people coming together for pretty much the first time. And at this stage, the team pretty much acts as individuals. In other words, they play it safe and they concern themselves with what's on their job description. There's very little clarity about what the team's purpose or individual roles are. So at that stage, the team probably is a little bit confused about what the team is there for. Probably not as confused as you are as the team leader, because you've probably been briefed by your manager and you're well aware of what the team's purpose is. But the question is really, do the rest of the team members know? So what the team naturally does at this stage is they default to doing their own individual work to the best of their ability, but there's not a lot of communication going on between team members, not a lot of synergy, not a lot of collaboration, because people aren't sure what that looks like and what the needs are for that. So that stage, people show a lot of energy, but it's mainly the energy is exhibited towards achieving their individual goals on their job description, and they're not thinking, or at least thinking in a secondary sense, about what the team's responsibility is. So that stage is, it's in that early stages, and you can probably guess what you need to do at that stage. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm just really giving you an overview of what these stages look like at this point. Now, what will inevitably happen, and this stage, this storming stage, can go on for a long period of time in teams, and I've seen it happen. Of course, it can go on for a short amount of time too, depending on how you lead your team through that storming stage. But really, what what the storming stage is about is there's conflict that arises because people begin to establish their place in the team. So there's a bit of argy-bargy. There's a bit of, assertion, and the dominant people in the team have a tendency to take over. And as a team leader, it's a difficult stage because what happens is the effectiveness of the team drops off because there's a little bit more interpersonal conflict. There's a little bit more of testing the water, and so forth. Now, I have seen this occur if a leader doesn't show some strong leadership in stage 2, that's the storming stage, then what happens is the team stays in that stage for a long period of time. In other words, the argument is there's a vacuum of leadership and other people in the team try to take over that role. So it's quite possible that that stage can continue for a period of time, depending on how assertive the leader is and their willingness to guide the team through that storming stage. It's inevitable that a team will go through this stage, so you can't actually bypass any of these stages, according to Tuckman. You actually have to go through a process of leading people through the 4 stages. But obviously the objective is to try to get people through the 4 stages as quickly as you possibly can. And that's important. Chelsea's just asking, Tim, at this stage as a leader, can our expectations be discussed? In the last seminar, help. It's not the role of the leader to resolve personality conflicts. Well, you've raised a couple of interesting points there, Chelsea. I think you're absolutely spot on that expectations are critical. In fact, I would argue that if you're looking at those 7 questions that you might recall that I went through in setting expectations or purpose, I would be doing that actually at the beginning, at the very early stages of team leadership, and that will help people move on to the next step. Now, you raised the question about the role of the leader in solving interpersonal conflict. I think the leader has a very important role to resolve that, and I think I have seen this happen before where leaders just think that we've got mature adults there, they can solve their own problems, leave them be, I'll only get involved if it becomes very serious, and inevitably it does, and the leader gets involved at the end. I think the important thing is to nip this in the bud. Now, let me give you a very practical example. If you have been appointed a team leader, whatever the sort of term you want to use, but let's say you're a leader of a team, and you have been appointed and someone else in the team has applied for that job as well. All right, now this is very common in my experience. The other person sort of carries a grudge because they feel that they should be the team leader, but of course you've been made the team leader. And it's a kind of an elephant in the room situation. Not much is said, but there's a lot of undermining that carries on. If you have been put in that position, then I would suggest there that one of the very first things that you should do is sit down with the person, knowing that they had applied for the job as well, and putting on the table the issue of that. All right, sounds a bit confrontational, doesn't it? But if you don't do that, then what happens, of course, is that you're not nipping something in the bud. Now, it may not be an issue for the other person. They might be perfectly happy. Yes, I missed out. You're the team leader, and I'm happy to work with you. But just by putting on the table that is, I think, quite important, because it allows the other person the opportunity to be able to talk about that, so that we're not having constant undermining all the way through the team process. So something to think about. And, people can carry grudges for long periods of time, I'm finding, and you just don't want that happening. But that's certainly one type of conflict that you can happen in a team as well. Thanks, Chelsea, for your feedback. Um, when you get to the norming stage, norming is a stage where, and norming means sort of middle of the road, average, if you like. There's a level of there's a level of consensus in the team, and there's a level of agreement in the team about what needs to be done. So there is some clarity around individual roles. There is some clarity around the team's purpose, but the team's not performing at a high level. But it is performing, but not to where you would like it to be. And I suspect, as I said earlier, there's a lot of your teams that are in this level. And the question then is, how do you get them to this next stage of performing? That becomes the critically important task. But at this stage, the individual members are aware that there's a team purpose. They're aware that they've got to work together as a team. They're not working at an optimal level of performance, but they're on their way. So your job, of course, is to take them to the next level. And I'll talk a little bit about what you can do to do that. So you can be stuck in the norming stage for a long period of time. In fact, some teams never move out of the norming stage. And this can be enormously frustrating for you as the team leader. So the question is, how do you move them on to the higher stage, the ultimate stage, which of course is the performing stage? And I'll of course address that as we go. Now, I'm just really here to give you a big picture of what these look like. Now, the performing stage is, and you probably work out when I say performing, the team has a very clear strategy and they have a shared vision, and it can operate autonomously and resolve issues positively. In other words, your role as a team leader now becomes a different sort of role, where you become the facilitator and the orchestrator and the conductor. So, people are willing to make decisions in the corridor. They're willing to make decisions. They're willing to show their initiative. They get on and get things done. And your job is to coach and mentor and encourage. And when you're at that stage of a team, it's a highly pleasant experience to get to. But don't expect that you're just going to go straight from zero to performing without you doing something different. And that's the point I want to make here, that it's important for you to be aware of these stages and to be starting to think, what can I do to move the team from a norming to a performing stage? And it is possible to do it. And really, I have to say to you, it's all about leadership in many cases. Of course, many people have inherited a dysfunctional team. And really, if you've inherited a dysfunctional team, you need to go back to square one and start again, but you won't turn them into a high-performing team overnight. They may well be happy that you're their new leader because they didn't like their old leader, but that's not necessarily going to mean that they're going to sort of get to that performing stage without some change from you. So, and they want to know. They want to know what your expectations are. They want to know how things are going. They're intelligent enough to know that you're going to have a different perspective on things than the previous leader. So all of that has to be done, and that's leadership. Chelsea says, I agree, it's about leadership, which is a very, very important to management, absolutely. And of course, this is all about what you as a leader can do rather than, what you're hoping the team gets. So, folks, they are the 4 stages. So now let's unpack that a little bit further and talk about each stage in a little bit more detail. And let's start thinking about what you might be able to do at each stage in order to get that team to move on to the next stage. Okay, so there's a lot on this page, this graphic that's coming up now. Here we go. Here we go. So let's have a look at each stage. Now you'll notice that there are the 4 stages in front of you, and you'll notice that on the top it talks about the tasks that have to be done and the behaviours that are exhibited during that stage. So we'll just unpack this a bit further so that we understand what this all means. So if you go right to the bottom and you look at the forming stage, the tasks are to identify similarities, agree on a common goal, um, establish a base level of expectation. That's what I was saying before, Chelsea, about the fact that that's the stage where you need to develop expectations and to articulate those clearly to your team. Your team is actually quite anxious to know what your expectations are. And if you're not explicit about it, they'll kind of just watch you and work it out. It's much better to be explicit about it, of course. So don't be afraid to say, these are the values that are really important to me in our team, and here are some baseline expectations that I have of you all and the team outcome. So don't be afraid to do that. That requires you, as I said in the last session, to do a little bit of homework and actually think very carefully about what your expectations are, and set your sights high, because it's a bit like the analogy of high jumps in track and field. It's interesting when you have a high jump competition, or even pole vaulting for that matter, what happens is they put the bar up a little bit higher, and what you tend to see is that people don't clear it by a huge amount. They only just clear the bar, which is human nature, but they at least need to know where the bar is in order to make an attempt, a jump. So your job, of course, is to lift the bar and make it very clear where the bar is, so that people can achieve that line in the sand that we've talked about the last session. So the behaviours that you will see is that people are in the early process of developing trust, because remember, this is probably a team that's just come together. They might sort of know each other, but they don't really have a deep level of trust or mutual respect at this point. Making contact and bonding, and that takes a little bit of time, but there needs to be some opportunities for you to do that. And the team members you'll find at this early stage are highly dependent upon you. So they'll come and annoy you about all sorts of things that they really probably should know the answer to, because they're worried about rocking the boat. So because they don't know clearly where their boundaries are and where they should be showing initiative, they will come to you for everything and anything. So if you're finding that people are doing that on a regular basis, it's probably because they're not clear about your expectations. Now, that's the first phase. Now, when you get to the storming stage, and it's very obvious when you're in the storming stage because there are power struggles going on in the team, there are people attempting to take control, and it can be a bit frustrating if you're the team leader. So it's, there's a little bit of argy-bargy going on, and look, at the end of the day, you've got to demonstrate that you know what you're doing, that you're the boss, and you're very clear about where you're taking the team. Now, if you're not a technical expert, but you're the leader of the team, in other words, there are people in the team that have higher levels of technical competency than you do, this becomes a little bit tricky, because obviously you're relying on your team to, make a call, make a decision. So, you can be at a bit of a disadvantage there, and that people will often criticise you behind your back, saying you don't really know what you're doing, and you've never experienced this sort of thing before, which is pretty typical that you get when your competency is being questioned in a team. Okay, so Gavin asks, does it always flow from forming to storming, or is it possible to jump to norming if forming was successful? Gavin, that's a really good question. No, the theory says that you will go through a period of argy-bargy, And it may not be a blatant, obvious period, but there will be a little bit of turf warfare. There'll be people looking to assert their authority in the team because they're not quite clear about what's going on and who's who and what am I responsible for. So it is important for you to recognise that it's not possible to bypass the storming stage. Having said that, you don't need to be in the storming stage for very long. And that's true. Elsie asks, what about counter-dependence? That's a very good, insightful question, Elsie, because what, for everybody, counter-dependence means is that teams, counter meaning opposite, counter-dependency means that people will attempt to undermine the team. There are some people who we would call counter-dependent. So what they're attempting to do is to try to drag the team back to, square one. And it's quite possible. Now, if you find someone that's being counter-dependent, in other words, they're trying to, perhaps undermine the fabric of the team harmony, what you really need to do is pull them aside, talk about their particular behaviours. So, you must use the critical examples, critical incidents, and you must explain to them that I'm trying to develop a team culture here where everybody's on the same page. And what you did yesterday and the day before, so, you give specific examples, is not helpful. And I need you to be on board. So, yes, it's very interesting that some people will often say to you, and sometimes they don't even say it, oh, I'm not a team player, I just come to work and do my job. Well, in my view, that's actually not non-negotiable, right? I mean, most people in this day and age work in a team, and you can't just be an individual out there doing your own thing. So you need to have a conversation with those people about that. Hopefully that's helped Elsie to explain the purpose of counterdependence and where it fits in. Now, if you you'll find that during these storming stage that people are expressing different points of view. For example, these are typical behaviours, or we should do it this way, or why are we looking at a new way of doing this when the old way works perfectly well? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, we've all heard these things. This is a typical behaviour of the storming stage where people are testing the validity of the approach that you are proposing. Now, when we get, so really it requires a little bit of strong leadership from you, some decisiveness, some firm conversations, and if you do that, hopefully people will get the message that you are deadly serious about teamwork. And if you don't have those conversations, what will happen is that this storming stage will last a lot longer than it should. So you really need to rein in any behaviour that you think is counter-dependent, which is the word that Elsie used before. Now, when we get to the norming stage, so the members are pretty much, the task is, of course, getting people to agree on priorities and roles and processes and so forth. This is the systemisation of the team. This is where you get some systems and processes that work well for the team. And I would say to you that during this phase, you should be reviewing your systems and processes. Now, when I say systems, I'm not necessarily talking about something bureaucratic. It just might be the way people go about their business. Now, you should put all of that on the table because I think perhaps one of the ways of getting a team from a norming to a performing stage is to review the systems and processes that you use. In other words, and do it collaboratively, because the team is at a sufficient level of maturity in the norming phase to be able to discuss these things, and try to get some sort of agreement about how things can be done better, faster, easier, safer, with more impact, with greater interpersonal cooperation and so forth and so on. So the norming stage is ideal to do that, and decisions are made at this stage through negotiation and consensus building. All right. So where you would be quite adamant at this stage is to say, no, we need to review our systems. No system's perfect. I'm open to new and better ways of doing things, and I need to work with you as a team and team members to work out how we'll do things better, faster, easier, and so forth. So often it's a systemisation process there, and I think at this stage there's a reasonable level of trust, otherwise you wouldn't be in the norming stage. And so you can have these conversations. And what I suggest is that in your team meetings, that you don't just have a mindless reporting process. Of course, reports are important. Of course, knowing where people are up to is important. But also leave room for a conversation around how we might do things better, faster, easier, and so forth. Use process mapping if you're familiar with it. Process mapping is where you map out a particular process that's applicable to your business or organisation and look at each part of the process. Talk to the team collectively about what we can do to make this more efficient and effective. And I think if you do those things, it's likely that you will start to see people not only getting over the crossbar that I mentioned before, but exceeding it quite significantly if you do that well. Now, that's not going to happen in one meeting, all right? And I don't suggest you throw everything on the table in one meeting, but just take one particular process that everybody's involved in and do a process map, and then just talk to people and say, how, I'm keen to look at some ideas and ways and means of being able to do this better. What do you think we should do? And talk to them about that and see what you can come up with. Now, when you get to the performing stage, what happens is, and I say when because it's very possible if you follow what I'm suggesting here. Now, when you get to the performing stage, this is when people are achieving good results, great results. Members are finding solutions to problems. They are working together collaboratively to solve everyday issues where they wouldn't be in the past. They'd be coming to you. So what you do see in this performing stage is that people start to work things out for themselves and they don't involve you as much. That's good. You want that because that suggests that that's a characteristic of the performing stage. So the members of the team are working very collaboratively. The members are taking care with each other. They're concerned about each other and their workloads and how they do things. Some friendships are formed in the team and the team is ticking along very nicely. The group establishes a unique identity. That's another very interesting characteristic of the performing stage. And when we look at Unit 6, I'm going to talk about team culture, but the team probably identifies more readily with the team than the organisation from which the team comes from. So the team has a bit of a unique structure. And I've seen this happen before where a high-performing team in organisations can go a little bit too far with this and isolate themselves from the rest of the organisation. So you've got to keep this balance between, team identity and not excluding themselves from the rest of the team. So it's a very interesting balancing act. But the team have a certain way of doing things. Somebody new coming into a high-performing team finds out very quickly what's expected of them, and they soon get socialised into what's required. So I know it's easy to talk about here in our Lunch and Learn series, but essentially you've got to keep your eyes and ears open to what stage people are at and what you might do in order to move them on to the next level, which is the critically important factor. Because as I said earlier, if you don't make the effort, what happens is, of course, people stay in that stage. So Jane's asking, can only a line manager influence change in a team, or can a more senior manager in the organisation change that? It's a good question. I think that ultimately the team will take its cues from the team leader, because the line manager, as you refer to them, or a senior manager, they're only going to see them every so often, and normally when they see them, it's normally when something's not going right. So you can't, and I know you're not making this point, Jane, but you can't abrogate your responsibilities here. The team will take their cues from you as the team leader because you're closest to the coalface, so to speak. You're the one that's there. You're the one that's going to be responsible for all of this. And so Chelsea's asking, does this relate to situational leadership model? Absolutely. So, different stages require different forms of leadership. And of course, in our next unit, I'm going to talk specifically about that. But the main thing I want you to get out of today is the fact that there are 4 stages and that you need to take different approaches at each of those 4 stages. Denise asks, is there a timeline this process takes to be more effective? Well, of course, the answer to that is as quickly as possible, but there is no timeline. There are other factors involved in this. If the organisation is dysfunctional, of course, it's harder because the team is still part of the organisation. So, you've got to work twice as hard, if not more, to get the team through the 4 stages. So there's that factor. There is also the factor that you might have some very difficult people in your team. The reality is they might be difficult. The reality is that the leader before you might be quite weak and allow all sorts of behaviours to have festered over a long period of time. And so therefore it's harder to change those behaviours. So that's another factor. The nature of the work that you do, the pressure that you're under organisationally, all of these things come into play. But the answer to your question, Denise, is that there is no time frame. You've just got to move as quickly as you can through the stages and try to recognise when you've gone through the hoops and got to the next stage. Gavin's asking, sometimes teams cycle between norming and forming with high staff turnover. Absolutely correct. So if, for example, you've got 7 people in your team and 3 of them, for whatever reason, leave, it is quite possible that you could go back. You can regress in this model, which I haven't really mentioned, have I? You can regress, so you can go from a norming stage back to a forming stage if half your team leave, because they're obviously keen to know what's next, what's required. How do we do things? They don't know. They've come in. They don't know who you are. You've got to, and I suggest strongly when you've got a new member of the team, you sit down with them and you explain to them what your expectations are of them, and you explain to them what your expectations are of the team. So you give them some orientation around the team input, apart from the obvious orientation around organisations. And that time's well spent, and I think you'll find that people will appreciate that. And then you make sure that you have another conversation with them after about a week, just to see how they've settled in, what's puzzling them, what questions can you answer, what have you noticed, what are your observations about the team. So be prepared to ask them some questions, and then perhaps a month or 2 down the track, give them some performance feedback. So that becomes really important. Lisa asks, or doesn't ask, just mentions, I sometimes find it tricky to balance between consistent with team members and knowing when they need to be more individual. This is always a paradox, Lisa, because everyone in the team has an individual responsibility, and you also have an overarching team responsibility. And so what happens is in the early stages of team formation, people are only thinking about their job description because that's where they can feel safe and secure, and so that they've ticked off all the boxes on their job description. But as the team matures, they start to recognise that there's a greater purpose, which is the team purpose. So it's a kind of a maturity thing. And a very practical example of that is that if somebody in the team is struggling with priorities, then somebody would be prepared to down tools and come and assist them. That would be an example of being in the performing stage, for example. So these things do sort themselves out once you can move through the cycle of the 4 stages of team development. So some great questions there, guys. Thank you very much. I hope that's sort of given you a chance to reflect on your own teams. So, look, a couple of key points about this, and I'll probably mention a couple of these. This will come up on your screen now. Every team goes through some parts of each stage. So, you know, the question was asked before, can we bypass? No, you can't. You go through these 4 stages, and every team goes through these stages. Some go through it quickly, some take a long time, but you all go through them. Each stage is critical to the team's development. So you actually have to go through a storming stage in order to get to a norming stage. So, you know, these characteristics are human nature. You have to actually accept them as reality and do something about it. The stages often play out simultaneously or in different order. Yes, you can regress, you can, you know, chop and change and so forth, and you may well be also in transition between one stage and the next. And, you know, interestingly enough, when you're in a transition point between 2 stages, your energy should be with those people who've moved on to the next stage, because what you're trying to do is create a critical mass where it's clear that the team's moving on. If you spend too much time with people who are back in a previous stage, a less mature stage, then the team that have moved on, or the team members that have moved on, will probably resent that, and they'll want you to spend some more time with them, helping them grapple with the challenges of the next stage. So, you know, your energy is very important where you spend it, your time. With many events and changes, the process repeats. So I think somebody alluded to this earlier when they mentioned with new team members coming in, and with a change. So there's an organisational change. There's a new direction, a new market, a new piece of legislation. Something has come into play which has really changed the fabric of what the organisation's all about. Well, obviously that's going to impact on the team as well, and you may find that you regress somewhat, but you can do that in a constructive way by doing those things that we suggested earlier. So just a couple of key points about the model. So it's there is all sorts of interesting nuances about the model itself. Okay, so let's just get down to some very practical things that you can do now as we come towards the end of our time together. Your role in the forming stage is to raise awareness. So what that means is that you should be, at this stage, it'll be high task, low relationship to compensate for the low follower readiness. So, you know, the focus is what people need to do. People are anxious about what their role is in the team. You need to spend time one-on-one with people, explaining to them what their role is and how they can contribute. So you need to, what are the values that you believe in? And look, you don't give people 25 values. You know, if I asked you and I said, what are 2 or 3 values that are absolutely critical to you in your role, in your organisation, I would expect that you'd be able to answer that. And I expect that you would be able to articulate that to the other team members as well, both collectively and individually. You should be clarifying what people's individual roles are. So first step is, what do people bring to the team? And that's what the forming stage is all about. Once people feel safe and secure about what their role is in the team, you are likely then to progress to the next stage. And if you can do that, then people are comfortable with at least understanding what their role is. But interesting enough, what you do then is you're creating some conflict, because there's obviously overlap on people's roles, and that's where the next stage comes in. So in a nutshell, in stage 1, it's all about what individuals are supposed to do to contribute to the team's output. And then, of course, you get a bit of turf warfare, because, you know, there's going to be inevitably conflicts between what people are doing in the team, and overlaps and all the rest of it. So your role is to maintain adequate production while building team cohesion. Now your job is to start building team cohesion, whereas in the early stage of the forming, it's about creating their individual responsibilities. Now it's about creating team harmony and cohesion. So your job, of course, is to start spending time listening to people. What are some of their concerns, and how can you assist them to overcome some of these priority conflicts and so on? You need to be more assertive than perhaps you may like to be. And assertive doesn't mean aggressive. It simply means to let people know where they stand, as I said earlier, using the analogy of the crossbar, where is the crossbar? You need to manage conflict when it arises and to do it actively. So if you see two people having some sort of an altercation, which is very characteristic of this stage, then you pull them aside and you say, look, I overheard some of that conversation, didn't pick it all up, but I'm keen to know what's going on. Let's talk about it. And then you get them together and try to work out where the common ground is. So don't abrogate your responsibilities at this stage. I've seen it happen so often, and of course the team conflict continues and festers and gets worse and worse, and the team stays in the storming stage for a long period of time. You need to be flexible and creative and adaptable and all of those kinds of things. So essentially what it means is that you need to be out and about, listening to people, resolving differences of viewpoint, looking at conflicts, dealing with them immediately and not waiting until they turn into some serious problem where you've got to down tools and spend all your time. Now, when you get to the norming stage, what we're really interested in here, as I said earlier, is to start to look at the way the team operates as a unit, how it can be improved. So some people at this stage will do some of these profiles, the team management profile, and some of these to sort of create some greater awareness of how people like to operate in a team environment. So that would be a very useful strategy to get people to progress from the norming to the performing stage. Having a sense of humour is critically important. Making sure that you've built alliances up with other members of the organisation, that there's good networks going on beyond the team so that people are cooperating with you as a team. You're promoting people's involvement, you're communicating and you're giving feedback on performance, not just individually but also as a team. In fact, it's a very good exercise at this point to go around the table if you've got a team meeting and say to people, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate our performance as a team? Great question. What you're doing, of course, is that you are evaluating where people see themselves, and then you ask the question, let's say the norming figure is, let's say you're operating at a 5 or a 6 out of 10, which is normally characteristic of being in the norming stage. You might then say, how do we go from a 6 to a 7? And just listen and try and engage your team in those sorts of conversations. So conversations are very important from a team perspective as well as individual. Now, when you get to the performing stage, your job is to give people recognition, let people know. And it's not just about saying thank you and giving people pats on the back and having celebrations, although that is important. It is very important, but it's also about showing people the extent to which you have moved and shifted and trying to measure performance. And I know in some of your teams that's not easy to do. Maybe that's a good conversation pointer. At the norming stage, how do we measure our performance as a team? What a great question to throw on the table. How do we measure our performance? Now, in some of your cases, and we've got lots of different organisations here, that may well be fairly obvious, but in others it may not be, and it might warrant a conversation about that. So your job at that stage is to put out bushfires, to problem solve, to strategize about the future, to do some mentoring where it's required, to coach people and to recognize performance. And if you do all those things, of course, you are likely to have achieved your objective at the performing stage. Now, it was mentioned earlier about situational leadership. There's the model, and I'm sure you've seen this before. And look, I just want to say this because the whole of the next unit is about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I really want to just say that at different stages of the team development, you are required to exhibit different styles of leadership. So you need to be flexible in the way you lead. It's not just it's no good saying I am what I am and that's just the way I am. You need to actually grow and change yourself, interestingly enough, because if you grow and change, then you are taking the team through a process of change. So it all starts with you as the team leader. I won't labour the point because we'll be covering a lot of that next time. So if it's a project team, the team's likely to dissipate. So they've added another layer on this, and the adjournment phase, where people actually, they might be working on a project and they go back to their substantive part of the organisation, and there's a little bit of sorrow that goes with that because the team's been, there's been some good memories, some good experiences, and so forth. So the team changes in the team membership will reset the team building process. I've mentioned that. And team persistence, getting through the formation process requires you to be the leader, and I mentioned that earlier. Okay, so what's your homework? Well, your homework, as you could probably imagine, has something to do with the stages. I want you to experiment and practice some of your leadership capabilities to accommodate the stage you're in. So first step is, and you've probably done this anyway, just listening to me, but what stage is your team in, and what can you do at this stage to readjust your leadership style to help the team move on to the next stage, if indeed it needs to move on. Now, if you're in the performing stage, of course, take a good hard look at yourself and say, how can I improve my leadership to continue this performing stage that we're in? Because remember, you can regress. So that's pretty much it from me. And if you've got any last minute questions, I would suggest you go for your life and ask those right now, because I'm about to sign off. And next time we meet, which will be in Unit 3, I really want to look at this whole notion of situational leadership and spend a bit more time crafting your leadership style, dependent, of course, on the situation that you're in at the time. Because if you can do that, then you'll accelerate your way through. Got a couple of comments and questions here. That was really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Sean. That's really great. I really appreciate that sort of feedback. You never really know whether you're hitting the mark, so that's nice. Thank you. At performing stage, would it be worth really putting energy into building your future team leaders? Absolutely, Chelsea. Great question. Yeah, at the performing stage, you are looking at building team leaders because people are now in that phase where they're working well together. And yes, absolutely. Yes, you should be doing that. So the answer is yes, of course, you should be doing that. Thank you, says Chelsea. I appreciate that. Thank you. Now, I'm going to sign off at this point, and you can see that next unit will look at tools of leadership teams, and we'll continue through the cycle. So thank you very much, everyone, because a lot of those questions and comments were very helpful and enriched the whole process. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Gavin. Thanks, Denise. And I look forward to seeing you. Thank you, Elsie. Look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Julene. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks, and start thinking about your team and its maturity, and we'll catch up very, very soon. So thank you, and I wish you all the very best. Have a brilliant weekend too, by the way. Thank you.